Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. In this episode, we explore how the Brexit negotiations became a defining test of the European Union's hegemonic power, revealing the interplay of structural influence, rhetorical framing, and some contested values. My guest today is Professor Patrick Holden. Welcome.
Thank you, Martin. Great to be here.
Dr. Patrick Holden is an associate professor in international relations at the University of Plymouth, where he leads the online master's program in international relations, security and development. His research focuses on the European Union's external relations, international political economy, and development policy. Widely published and active in policy debates, he brings both academic depth and practical insight to questions of Europe's global role and the future of international order. Drawing on Dr. Holden's recent article, What Kind of Hegemony? The European Union in its Region, published in the Journal of European Integration, I prepared some key questions for today's interview. But before we dive into the more in-depth analysis, I'd like to start by understanding Professor's intellectual journey. And there is one question that you can elaborate on, and that's how did you first come to explore this topic, and what led you to connect the European Union with the concept of hegemony? And you are implementing in the article the neo-Gramscian conceptualization.
Thank you, Martin. I'm quite heterodox, and as an academic, I engage with a lot of theories, almost to the extent that could annoy people. I very much believe it's the question you're asking, and the level of analysis you're looking at, and so on. So I've used in my career a lot of theories of Susan Strange. I suppose in spirit, I'm probably a mid-range constructivist, in that I believe in reality and objective causality, but I do believe in the great importance of language and perception as well. And as you've noted, I mostly wrote about the EU's external relations, initially with Mediterranean and Middle East. But I've been thinking for some time about the EU's power within its own region and how it seemed to align with hegemony. Various relatively trivial things got me thinking. I remember, for example, in one of the EU's standoffs with Viktor Orban's Hungary over funding, Hungarian trade unions, a confederation of, were lobbying the EU in support of them doing that. So that this kind of interested me, this kind of transnational, or in this case, national interest group connecting with a transnational organization against their own government, and how what this revealed about it. Specifically about Brexit, I'd always thought that the Brexiteers were kind of half right, and that the right that the EU is a substantial power structure, and indeed not angelic in all senses as well, but that they were wrong in terms of describing it as some kind of crude empire like the Roman Empire or something like that, which they have tended to do. In a bit more abstract, I suppose this anyone that looks at the EU internationally will always be looking at kind of interests versus values, and hegemony is a concept and a theory that does allow us to combine that. So I think also being Irish, I was particularly interested in Brexit. I did write a separate article about Northern Ireland, and when it had all kind of blown over, Michel Barnier released his memoirs, which are a very good read for anyone interested in European studies, and then Stefaan De Rynck. I thought, yeah, this is kind of a nice insight here into what happened, and the operation of a certain form of power. So that's what brought me to it, I suppose.
Yeah, I will include the articles link and all your publications in YouTube description. So let's start with some evident question, and that's how did the EU's sustained regional power become evident in its communication and political actions during the Brexit negotiations? And what does this reveal about the nature of the EU's hegemonic model?
Yes, well, I think from quite early on, it became apparent that the EU was very much laying the table and shaping the negotiations. Some, to an extent, that might be obvious, but of course, the UK is a substantial power in its own right, and the EU had lots of other problems, not least Trump's first presidency and his hostility. But despite this, it became apparent that this process was almost resembling in enlargement in reverse, with the EU kind of setting the key criteria, uh, establishing its priorities first, very much using its market power and forcing the UK to make compromise after compromise and engage in its kind of sequence. Now, to an extent, of course, Brexit was a test for the EU on its stronger points. Is one thing that the EU as a system has done well over the years is um, closed ranks when it needed to in its region, consolidated its economic power, and used this gravitational pull, this market power to bring countries into its orbit and then manage this in various ways. Um, in terms of what it tells us about the EU, how it works, again, you have this definitely quite diffuse nature of it. Obviously, compared to a state, you've got the member states working through the European Council. You've got various interest groups that came on board, as well as, of course, the supranational institutions, very much the Commission in the lead. And you see how it kind of marshals this not very precisely. It's a convoy. It's not a kind of tightly wound, perfect machine, but it does work in the political sense for a situation like this, in that it does bring together critical mass and exert power and defines really. The options for a country like the EU, for like the UK rather, economic and political.
Beyond official statements, how did the EU's core institutions and established structures exert influence over the Brexit process, and what were the tangible effects of this structural power?
Yes, well, I think that the basis for this was kind of purely structural, in that just the sheer economic imbalance. You have the EU 27, which is not just a much larger market. Also, in trade terms, numbers matter, and it's 27 states versus one. And also beyond the 27, of course, you have very close legal arrangements with, Norway, um, Turkey, Switzerland, and in candidates in Central and Eastern Europe. So that was the kind of underlying structural imbalance. This was again kind of actualized via the legal framework. Again, this is a very long term, but the Article 50 process, which was designed by a Brit, actually, funnily enough, very much disadvantages the leaving state, in that you have the 2 year window and then a bit of a vacuum that most states, would want to avoid, even a relatively wealthy one like the UK, let alone a poorer state that might be leaving the EU. So this put them in a strong position. And then you have what actually is the standard EU playbook. And some of what I saw reminded me of my studies of how the EU has dealt with developing countries, uh, in that you have the European Commission as, I suppose you'd call it, the bad cop, relatively tough negotiator laying down the law, but with a mandate from the European Council to do that. So they're not really as separate as some might think. While individual member states, you can imagine, say, a small Baltic state doesn't want to get into an argument with the UK. It's a valuable security partner, but they either don't want or aren't really given the opportunity, but probably don't want to rock the boat on the EU consensus on a relatively tough negotiating stance with the UK. The main substantial issue we should remind ourselves was that the EU was, refusing to negotiate the economic relationship with the UK until some key issues, uh, people, financial obligations, and the Northern Ireland question were at least formally resolved, or they got some commitments on that. Um, And this system, we could talk if there's time about how it hasn't worked with Trump, which is a very exceptional case. This system, I give here and elsewhere as well, although awkward, as I said, it does work, not in the sense that you may or may not agree with it, but it's actually quite an effective negotiating framework because there's enough room for individual member states to say their case and hammer out positions. But then the Commission is the agent, in this case, pushing or cajoling the UK along to agree to various things about repaying debts, even though some of these debts weren't really legal debts, and agreeing things about Northern Ireland in particular that would prove fateful. So I think that was the key kind of action from the institutions and the key method, and it's all like EU power in general in its region. It's all based on this combination of relative geo-economic unity. There have been some reports out, obviously, recently saying that that's not enough and it has to unify more, but we might talk about that. But relative, definitely compared to other regional blocs with the common currency and the single market. And then these institutions, quite diffuse, but that can work if there's a strong enough political motive, which the UK gave it. So that's
When researching structural power of the European Union, was there anything surprising for you that perhaps you didn't expect to find out? Or maybe it was slightly out of that common perception that it's in the UK about the European Union?
Yeah, well, you can never be sure with the EU because, of course, it does have its principles and its precedents, but it is like a political institution. It's capable of changing these, which it's done dramatically recently in the Trump deal, for example. And, the commercial interests are substantial. So I was initially, I didn't know which way it would go, and also with the UK security role, which is substantial. But what emerged was a much more, I've called geoeconomic or geopolitical, definitely political logic about setting the terms for non-member European states rather than immediate commercial interests in the UK. I think that's what perhaps surprised me. But then looking into it more closely, I saw really how great the imbalance was in terms of trade negotiations. It's just 27 countries, and while they supplied the UK with a lot of things, it only got from them really. The reverse wasn't the case. That they could, if necessary, if it came to some kind of trade war, replace their imports from the UK. So I think I didn't fully realize the depth of the imbalance there, and that the EU could hold it together and not be divided, which it has been in the past.
Dr. Holden, there is a common question, and many students always ask this question. Is the EU values or interest-driven bloc? So during your research, during the Brexit negotiations, what was more obvious for you? Was it more about interest or was it more about values?
Well, this is why I chose the hegemony, although it might annoy your students because it kind of it elides the question in that certainly certain types of interests and normative values can combine. That's the point really about in this case. I'm not actually a Marxist, I would say, but Gramsci's Marxist approach was to somehow cultural and ideological values could align with class interests. But what I think is interesting is how you define interest in the longer term or in the shorter term. I think it is true that the EU did not prioritize immediate commercial interests, which it took risks on, because we should remember the UK as a market isn't that far behind the US as a market for the US actually, or for the EU rather. So it did take some risks there for the longer term interests of making sure that the EU economic legal integration package was solid and would not be completely unraveled. So I think that's the answer to that. Of course, at a given moment in time, it's probably interests, but an organization like the EU does represent the successful up to a point combination of norms and interests. I should mention the article by Diaz, which did although I'd started my article long before I came across it, but you as other scholars will often find, you find someone who's writing something you've had an intuition about, but developing it very well. So Diaz had this normative power as hegemony, which is definitely worth reading, and that's I consider my article a kind of follow up from this, even though I'd finished the draft before I came across Tomas's very very great work on that point. I knew his work on other issues, obviously.
The UK's rejection of key principles like the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and the free movement of people challenge the very essence of the EU's hegemonic framework. What does this challenge reveal about the inherent vulnerabilities of a power based on integration?
Yeah, well, I'd say let's talk to apparent vulnerabilities and actual, but it's obviously very important, this initial UK stance, because I think it actually made it easier for the EU in in a couple of very important senses, but above all in marshalling the different political forces. I suppose the most obvious example is Ireland, which is now a very pro-European country, but obviously deeply embedded and intertwined with the UK as well. But when Theresa May said we're not just leaving the EU, but we're leaving the entire legal system, then the Irish government obviously realised that there was no hope for them to find some kind of midway. And they would have been very much on the EU side anyway, but this dispelled any serious discussion of some alternative negotiation with the UK, because this meant the Northern Ireland border issue would be a big issue, because you can't have a country that's not at all part of any laws and norms, laws and customs procedures, not having a border with a lot of countries that do. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that was a blunder from the British. I think it's interesting to look at if they had started with, I don't know, your viewers might remember its history now, the Chequers Agreement, which was a slightly sketchy, but an idea for some kind of halfway alignment. I think that would have made it more challenging for the EU to deal with. But as it stands, this challenge, which pointed towards a vulnerability, but also in reality reinforced the EU's power. It pointed towards a vulnerability because obviously the EU is based on this kind of package deal of certain different types of freedoms and a fair amount of regulatory harmonization and enforcement, a legal system, a very political legal system, but a legal system nonetheless very developed and intricate. And if one major part of the EU economy does, abstract itself from that is definitely a challenge. However, Barnier and the other leaders, including Macron and Merkel, could make a virtue of this by saying, look, this is an existential threat to us. The UK, okay, they might be an ally, but they're really not wanting any part of our historical system of legal alignment and cooperation and so on. So in this case, they could make a virtue of it. But I do note in the article that what's interesting about this form of regional hegemony is that it is kind of vulnerable in ways, at least superficially, and that its power mechanism, it reproduces itself partly because of this vulnerability, because this allows the leaders to say, look, we need to do this because otherwise the entire system will unravel. That could be, we need to go to some common European borrowing during the pandemic, or in this case, we need to marshal a a very rigorous and tough stance vis-a-vis the UK, or we can unravel.
When we speak about vulnerabilities, can we say after some time during the Brexit negotiations, who understood vulnerabilities in a better way, the European Union or the United Kingdom?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I said, I think the EU partly rhetorically used vulnerabilities, although they also did understand them. I think they understood correctly that if it did come to some kind of no deal or trade war, they would be in a significantly stronger position. The UK, again, you have to separate obviously their political rhetoric and their actual actions. Their actions suggest that they probably did understand their vulnerabilities more than they said, because they did mostly compromise when it came to it, and they didn't want to leave without a deal. But I think initially, as we might come to, they were, it seems, overconfident on what their national power could get them.
And the last question about that vulnerability, because this is very interesting for me. When you were researching those vulnerabilities, what was the most difficult for you to research or to get information or fundamental documents about? Because we know that EU is a huge complex of agencies, institutions, and everything.
Yeah, well, actually, Martin, that aspect of it was not the most challenging, because they were interesting. Like I said, they were explicit about the core vulnerability, which was that if we give the UK a deal that allows it to gain the advantages of the single market and customs union without the same level of responsibilities and legal commitments, then it's going to unravel our community, our union, which again I think is interesting, because it's almost admitting in principle or in blood that there is a better kind of state than being in the EU possible. They would say that in the long term this wouldn't work, but but that there is a temptation there, and so that wasn't kind of real research. This was in the public statements. What the actual vulnerabilities of the EU are in a given state, I think, are also probably clearer in the case of the EU than most others. Everyone knows that Orban will be doing whatever, and everyone knows that the French will have certain positions, and Germans, different ones, and so on. So I would say in the case of the EU, its vulnerabilities are more explicit, at least most of them. States, different types of states, that might be a different question. They're not going to advertise, oh, we're completely dependent on raw earths from China or something, which the US found out it was recently. So on.
How did key European Commission leaders, such as Barnier and De Rynck, use specific language and rhetorical strategies to frame the Brexit challenge in a way that reinforced the EU's position?
Yes, that reinforced the EU's position. Well, I think the main technique was, again, mostly to borrow from the standard playbook with close partners, i.e., accession states, or maybe some developing countries, and to standard hegemonic language to frame the EU's preferences as the fundamental reality that had to be adjusted to by the other side. So Barnier would say, "Oh, the clock is ticking," and this is true. There was a legal mechanism that there was only 2 years for the negotiation, but we know that the EU can very quickly change at least some legal mechanisms when it wants to as well. So I still consider this more of a deep political preference rather than ineffable reality. They also used international trade law to say things like, "Oh, we can't give you this kind of special deal, because then we'd have to give the same to everyone else." So this kind of quite a lot of legalistic language. Quite essentially a liberal. There's a germ of another article about kind of liberalism in the specific form of EU hegemony, but they definitely framed it in ways of of preserving rights. And so in the Northern Ireland case, they didn't say, we're trying to take Northern Ireland from the UK or something like that. They said, we want to preserve the rights of people in Ireland to move and to travel, and we want to preserve the rights of people from the rest of the EU, at least to live securely in the UK and so on. And they present themselves then as this kind of guardians of a liberal a European order, as well as the standard kind of technocratic language. And I mentioned in the article the famous Barnier staircase infographic, which was a brilliant example of an infographic and a communications tool, where you have the flags of various countries denoting their relationship to the EU and what they're willing to accept. So, like Norway towards the top, and then you go down a bit Switzerland and so on, and Turkey as a customs union, then you come to other countries. This was, I think, very effective because it both showed clearly a certain reality, and that the EU wasn't going to come up with a special deal for the UK, and it also made it look negative because, like, you're going down the stairs, maybe falling down the stairs and so on. So, but a lot of technocratic language as well, and the EU does have this habit of, in dealing with some partners at least, just kind of saying, "Oh, they just don't understand." There's something that might be true, and it probably was true in the case of some British leaders. But there are also cases where there's just a different political perspective. It's not that someone is mentally deficient necessarily. They just have a different political perspective to the EU or the Commission as the interlocutor.
So, how did the concept of power balance play out in the discussions between the European Union and the United Kingdom, and what did the EU leaders' perspective on this balance reveal about their hegemonic goals?
Yeah, I must say that they wouldn't have used the phrase power balance. And indeed, although I do use the phrase in the article, I don't mean in a very conceptual way or some kind of neo-realist way about power balance. Really, it's about economic imbalance and the institutional and legal realities all working together. I think you do see, which is interesting on the UK side, as in this case, the weaker side, you see increasing tension, obviously a political turmoil, very angst-ridden votes in the House of Commons where they try to agree something. You see Theresa May having to resign. You see basically the tension where one entity is trying to engage with a more powerful entity, in this case the EU. While from the EU side it was mostly quite smooth and self-congratulatory, but they also did prepare more for a no deal than the UK also. But even this was part of the political technique, because it could be it was kind of a warning to the UK as well.
In the article, you describe the roles of Barnier and De Rynck as lead negotiators. How did their individual positions and communication styles reflect the broader strategic goals of the European Commission? And perhaps if you can say one or two sentences like who was Barnier and who was De Rynck, because we might have some people who don't know.
Yeah, so obviously Michel Barnier was the Commission's chief Brexit negotiator. That means quite powerful at the political level, I suppose, as much as a commissioner. But there were, of course, the president of the Commission. De Rynck, obviously, much more at a technocratic level, a senior kind of trade negotiator. And I would note that both their books offer something different. Barnier, I wouldn't say he skims in the detail, but there's a lot on the politics as well. De Rynck is particularly interesting if you're interested in political economy, on the detail of the trade negotiations, on the institutional machinations within the EU and how they worked out what to offer the UK and how to negotiate with it. I think Barnier obviously did his job very well. Subsequent events have shown he's not infallible. So he had a brief period as French Prime Minister, a disastrous bid for the French presidency as well, during which he also suggested at least resigning from some EU rules for a while, so thereby showing the kind of the flexibility there can be among the EU leadership. But what he did well, I wouldn't say his job was easy. He wasn't in a powerful position, but he did well by marshalling the different forces, including interest groups and different member states, and keeping everyone on board, because it is a sensitive issue, because there's a lot at stake, and not all member states don't necessarily have a national working in the team and so on, and that's not how it's supposed to work anyway. But so we did a good job of doing that and presenting, I think, a very professional kind of accomplished face for the EU. So we definitely did that job well. I think he was very much on board with the broader EC and EU strategy. There are issues where the president gets involved as well, the president of the commission, but there wasn't too much between them on that. So I think his job to a large extent was not a mediator, but partly that, a facilitator and representative, and to keep a rigorous face vis-a-vis the EU.
Regarding communication styles, and this is what I have to ask, is there anything that we should learn from when we speak about both Barnier and De Rynck?
Communication style. Well, De Rynck wasn't doing public communications, so it's hard to say. Barnier, again, he did what he did well, polished, quite clear, I think, mostly speaking in English, obviously. He has obviously there are different negotiating styles, but Barnier seems to have that quite kind of calm sense of authority without being aggressive. I think that's the key in most negotiation scenarios. So I think that was his, and he was as well. You need a command of the detail. Certainly for anything at the EU level, there needs to be something behind the communication skills. Definitely, you need to be able to grasp quite intricate trade, legal, and institutional facts.
In the article, I noticed that you use qualitative analysis mostly. And can we compare the qualitative analysis of rhetoric on power and how this offers sort of deeper understanding of the EU's hegemonic strategy than when we speak purely about economic or material analysis, like numbers and things like that?
Yes. Well, I suppose before going to methods, I suppose I obviously don't see them as entirely separate, the material and then the discursive ideational power, but there are separate things to look at. I think certainly in a situation like this, where there's something new, Brexit, it's unprecedented, and there's quite a lot of confusion and different ways of viewing it. In this case, language becomes particularly important. Now, you can study language quantitatively as well, but I think this doesn't usually work very well, because you need to understand the words really more in context rather than as part of a qualitative whole, rather than how many times Barnier started to talk about trade or security or something. That can tell you something as well. But I think in particular, for an era of crisis and uncertainty, to look at how different actors are framing events is particularly important.
Right. To close this chapter about Barnier and De Rynck, I would like to ask you, how do you see this after sort of years, after time? And do you think that our colleagues, scholars, they study Brexit negotiations enough? Or is this topic which is already, like it's over, so we are moving on? Because to me, it's quite significant event. And as you said, it's unprecedented. We didn't have this experience before. So it's quite important for the history, for the scholarship as well.
It's a good question. I think a lot and a lot of good quality stuff has been written on Brexit, kind of all aspects, the political, economic, the legal, and what it means for the EU. Um, but it is I wouldn't say Brexit is ongoing. I think that's confusing, but the relationship of the UK and the EU in the broader political economy is evolving all the time, so that will need to be looked at because despite what I've written and said, and the fact that Northern Ireland within the UK still remains in the EU's orbit, and indeed the UK is beginning to align on some issues as well, including agricultural, but also some more technical regulatory issues. So that power is working. It still did substantially separate in terms of trade rules, and we see this in the kind of ongoing economic changes. So I think that's still worth looking at. Um, in, so I wouldn't say I would say it's been ignored, but it definitely is an important example. I think when you want to know any institution, you need to understand how to join it and how to leave it. I think that's a very important insight into any institution and what it really is and how it really works. And Brexit is the example of that. Um, UK obviously is different from other member states. The other dimension that was different, I think, from most potential leavers is that the UK was a kind of net contributor rather than some states who sometimes are seen as potential leavers or being thrown out, even though there's no mechanism to do that. Other states, depend a lot on cash transfers for the EU. So that's another what do you call this? It's another tool in the EU's closet, or I suppose, or in the EU's toolbox. And indeed, for countries in the euro, again, it gets much more difficult and complicated to consider leaving. So the UK was an outlier in that sense.
Let's speak about some implications now. In what ways did the Brexit crisis force the European Union to redefine its relationships with non member states? Especially when we speak about market access or maybe some future precedents set by this process.
Yes, that's a great question. So there has been like an ongoing situation of what I think we call differentiated integration. You can see the work of Frank Schimmelfennig and others on that in EU. Some also use the term external governance, by which they mean they talk about the fact that various non-member states, the EEA states, obviously, Switzerland in complex ways, Ukraine in particular, even before 2022, Turkey, and of course candidate states and those on the accession track are aligning to a lesser or greater degree with EU laws and engage with its institutions. UK, as I've stressed, offered something at least at first substantially different because it said it was going to leave totally and not go onto one of these other ledges or into one of these set orbital pathways around the EU. Um, and in doing so, again, it forced the EU to reveal, or perhaps some would say to construct, what it means to be an EU member. And I would say some of this is, I think, constructed. Not that I personally disagree with it necessarily, but for example, no cherry picking again was the EU mantra to avoid giving the UK advantages. But of course, all kinds of countries do have special relations, and not everybody is fully integrated in the EU, even some member states and so on. So that always does go on, but they wanted to articulate a pretty solid sense of what the EU was and what all European states should engage with, or at least the parameters for them to outline their rights and responsibilities. Four freedoms, I suppose, are the best ways to think about that, or how they articulated it. Also, the moment when Theresa May abandoned her hardline stance and came up with this checkers idea of alignment. This was kind of a problem for the Commission, because now the UK was softening and it was saying, okay, we might align with some laws, at least for a while, and so on. But they didn't want to give it some kind of competitive advantage by picking and choosing. So then you see, I have a quite long quote in the article. Barnier has to explain that it's not just about enlargement, it's not just about alignment, it's about having common supervision and a common legal system with institutions and so on. And this is what defines a state having full kind of market access to the EU. The implications of this were felt, I think, mostly by Switzerland. Switzerland had a relatively loose relationship with the EU legal system. It had, of course, had to sign up with freedom of movement and to shadow, various laws on various regulations and laws. But this was in a large series of bilateral treaties and quite ad hoc. And the Commission, since, I think, under pressure of Brexit, has then convinced Switzerland to sign up to a more rigorous form of comprehensive legal alignment, at least establishing the role of the European Court of Justice. This is controversial in Switzerland, but it has been signed up to. So we'll see how that agrees. For enlargement countries, I think countries looking to join the EU are being used to be held to a certain standard, higher sometimes than EU member states have themselves. So I think it probably hasn't changed things that much for them. I think it's reinforced the kind of geo-economic turn of the EU, as in with less of a focus on free markets and a bit more on an interventionist logic in terms of trade and energy and that anyway. Now, this was happening anyway, of course, not least because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and because of the rise of China and liberal capitalist states and Trumpism. But Brexit both took away the kind of largest and what had been the most liberal economic, large member state that was also liberal, and then presented a form of geo-economic rivalry in Western Europe that countries like Norway and Switzerland did not, because they were quite a bit smaller. So that's been the major implication, I think.
There is one follow-up question. I think it's quite logical. Based on your research and experience with the European Union, do you think that after Brexit, the European Union should strengthen or to give more competencies to its external service? Because this is quite often criticized that the EU internally, there is a competition between the European Commission and the external service when it comes to foreign policy and dealing with the geopolitical challenges.
Yeah, I don't think it should, and I wasn't a big fan of the external service or some of the EU's efforts for a common security and defense policy, just because not so much the actions against Russia. I think they're justified, obviously, and good, but just because it's not realistic, because member states still have their different foreign policies and cultures, and it can just create a kind of simulation of a unity that isn't there and can lead to confusion. The famous capability expectations gap, which people remember from the 1990s. I think we've seen in recent years with the High Representative role in particular, Borrell, who was saying some things I agreed with about, say, Gaza, but he wasn't supported by the EU, so his voice wasn't particularly influential, and the same for the current leader as well. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about EU foreign policy just because I don't think it's feasible apart from some obvious core interests like Russia invading a state in um, in Eastern Europe or preventing an absolute humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, apart from some common interests like that. Even that one though obviously isn't felt by all member states. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about that form of EU foreign policy.
Let's elaborate on internal and external pressures a little bit more, and let's connect these two elements to the EU's hegemonic power. Do you think that Brexit was a successful test of the resilience of the EU's hegemonic power?
Yes, is a short answer. It was, and I think if you think about it, not only did Brexit vote happen in 2016, but then Trump was elected. Trump, of course, is explicitly hostile to the EU for a number of reasons. Its trading policies, its cosmopolitan, supranational nature, and its liberal rhetoric, and so on. The EU has definitely been one of the I think number one enemies of Trump. So this was a real challenge. But as it worked out, Trump did little tangibly to help the UK. And indeed, De Rynck argues, I think convincingly, that this threat also helped the European Commission rally the member states for a tough stance because they said, look, Trump is now kind of attempting almost, or would like to even break up the EU. So again, you have this vulnerability or threat leading to a closing of ranks and a consolidation of critical mass. So it was useful to them in that sense. However, I think it would have been very interesting if the full Russian invasion of Ukraine had happened in, say, 2016 rather than 22, or during the Brexit negotiations. That might have, because obviously Central and Eastern European states in particular appreciate the UK's security role. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate the UK's military power. It's not, in many respects, it's not what it was, but it's still a major military power on the European continent. Well, obviously, one of the two major ones, at least. So I think that that might have led to some different priorities. I think that would have been a bigger test, and also, as we now realize, in the first Trump presidency, he was quite hamstrung by having lots of advisors who didn't agree with him. In fact, Barnier says very interestingly that below the level of Trump himself, relations with the US more or less continued as normal in the first Trump presidency. That's not the case now. And he also even stated that Trump's trade representative, Lighthizer at the time, was even quite sympathetic with him, saying to him about the UK, one UK proposal like, how do you deal with these people and so on. It's kind of basically the empathy of one major power to another in dealing with what are seen as erratic behavior by a smaller economic power. But that, of course, it's different now. So that particular test, it did pass, but if that isn't to say that it's invulnerable, it obviously isn't, and we have now very extreme external challenges between Russia's in war in Ukraine and Trump's hostility. I do say, though, in the article, and part again of the reason for writing it, is the historical durability of the EU before the European community and its ability to reinvent itself is quite impressive. It's over 70 years now of serious regional integration in Europe. So it's not just a historical accident. It's not just an epiphenomena, and it's not just a feature of liberal globalization or even just a feature of American power. So there's something substantial there.
I'm glad you mentioned American power because I would like to add another element to our debate, and that's the US hegemony. So let's speak about the EU hegemony under the shadow of the US hegemony. And maybe we can also touch a question of autonomous existence. Like, can it be fully autonomous? when we speak about the EU hegemony?
Yes, it's a great question. I did want to deal with that, and one of there are of course criticisms of using the term hegemony for the EU, and in fact the reviewers for this article in Journal of European Integration were very tough, but also very fair. It clearly wasn't their favorite concept or theory, but they did. Force me to work it out. The obvious alternatives are kind of global liberal capitalist hegemony, which I mean you could say is a thing, but it operates on a different dimension or level than what we're looking at. But certainly, U.S. hegemony has been a kind of a constant and is a key feature. I approach this in a number of ways. One, I did have the principle that I think it was possible to be an economic power and an economic hegemon in a region without necessarily having full geopolitical power, which the EU clearly doesn't. This is because you can make yourself indispensable to various actors, and you can, over time, shape your own destiny. And I did think, though, that the US was more constrained than it has been under Trump 2. Trump 2 is really an interesting and dramatic change because it not only is not constrained by international laws or norms, not really constrained by domestic either. So in the past, for example, the EU could stand up to the US on some trade and regulatory issues, knowing that it would have not so much allies, but to some extent aligning forces within the US, either legal system or very substantial business interests that would not want some kind of full economic war with the US. Under Trump, it's different though, and this is certainly making it harder to argue for EU hegemony. I still think when all this is over, the EU is certainly losing face and giving in to Trump quite a bit. But I still think when it's over and Trump won't last forever, the EU will still exist. It will still be regulating the European economy, which will be a very different one to the US, which more its focus on the green economy and renewable energy. Unlike the US, I don't think Trump will succeed in changing countries to his 19th century approach to energy policy. And even though it's being a bit careful in how it regulates big tech at the moment, it will still have those laws and the ability to implement them when the time comes. So I think broadly, I also think it is feasible, certainly for the US to withdraw from Europe and the EU to maintain its regional hegemony. To withdraw is different from the US actively trying to destroy it. But I don't think Trump will be able to do that because he doesn't offer enough. If you think about even say an awkward EU member state like Hungary, they still, okay, their funds have been frozen, but there's still tens of billions on the line, potentially coming from the EU and elections coming in Hungary soon. What could Trump offer them? Trump isn't going to offer tens of billions. He doesn't work like that. So I don't think he'll be able to break up the EU. However uncomfortable he can make it, and he certainly is humiliating it up to a point with these very unequal trade deal he's made them sign. But I still think the EU can withstand this and retain the long-term ability to shape its own region. There's a lot of obviously very high-level reports and initiatives about that at the moment, which are well worth reading. The Draghi report, very, very political report about the economy, calling for stronger EU powers in various senses and resiling from some liberal trade laws to an extent as well. The Leatter report on the internal market, the single market, well, slightly less political, but also trying to redouble European integration. I haven't seen any serious ideas on how to kind of break up the European Union, or for European member states to have a different, substantially different geo-economic path. Obviously, the UK is the closest to that. Because we have to remember that the real question is not so much is the situation in Bulgaria or Italy great, but is there a feasible way that you think it will be better not being in the EU? That's the real question for politicians and elites in those countries, and most continue to say no, which again we can see as the enduring hegemony of the basic idea that European states need to not just collaborate but integrate to be able to exert power over themselves and in the world. But definitely, the article does not deny that US hegemony is a thing, and that EU hegemony has been nestled within it. But I do think it's very hard to predict, but I do think it can persist. It can persist without US hegemony as well.
The last question for today's interview, Dr. Holden. What do you think, based on your research, that the EU hegemony really needs at the moment? Because we live in very difficult geopolitical times, and perhaps there are some elements that you would stress that the EU leaders should consider, because the EU hegemony as a power, as a concept, needs this or that.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, I suppose the Draghi report, although he obviously doesn't use the phrase EU hegemony, but he is talking that language, and he doesn't say, and he says that, look, there's no other solution than more Europe or more integration. I suppose it's not really my expertise, but everyone talks about the capital markets union, and the fact that the savings and the great financial assets of Europe aren't really mobilized for it in the same way as they are, for example, in the US. And this is connected with more joint borrowing, or what they call issuing of safe assets on the EU level. I think that would be a logical next step to complement the reality of monetary integration and so on as well. So it needs to do that. It's going to have to figure out a new trade policy, and the China challenge, which is in some ways China is a bigger challenge to the EU than to the US, because the US had given up on quite a lot of manufacturing, but the EU remained the kind of main Western manufacturing bloc. But its role here in Germany, obviously, in its role in particular, is being increasingly challenged by the EU. So I suppose what my answer reveals is that I still think that not just pure economics, but socioeconomics is the core of the EU and what people expect from it. And that is still, I think, what is needed for it to continue to reproduce and maintain its hegemony. I don't think initiatives like getting rid of the veto on foreign policy, I don't think that would be wise at all. I think it would be putting a greater level of unity than would be feasible, and will lead to all kinds of cracks. So yeah, I still, obviously many would say more of a defense union and so on as well. Again, I've always been a bit skeptical about how that can work, but I would still say the continued socioeconomic, balanced socioeconomic integration and reinvention is the key for the EU. The rise of the far right or populist right-wing parties, I haven't mentioned as well. It's interesting, and most of those have given up on the official idea of leaving the EU. They want to take it over as a structure of power. I think they wouldn't be able to do that. I think the EU would just split if they tried to do it, because the EU is intrinsically pluralist and complex, and that's how it works. And so just a bunch of right-wing populists, even if they got critical mass in member state governments and in the parliament, I think wouldn't be able to run it.
Dr. Holden, many thanks for your insightful thoughts that you shared your research outcomes with us. And I think it's a very interesting topic. It has so many implications to other areas of research, especially international relations. So many thanks again for being on IR Thinker, and I wish you all the energy. Good luck with your research, and we are waiting for more publications to read about this fascinating topic. Many thanks.
Thank you, Martin. I've really enjoyed it.